Great. Well, thank you everybody for being here. I'm Chris Butler, and I'm going to be talking to you about the product mindset. So yeah, I think you've gone through an awful lot of presentations so far today. This is really meant to take a look at not only the, after you going through all these different frameworks, techniques, processes, methodologies, great presentations like those from Teresa Torres, Jeremy Horn, who's my boss. I really want to try to boil down what is the product mindset from a product management perspective. How does that get separated from what product management is as a practice? And then how I think the product mindset itself is actually a humongous change in the way that people think, and probably a bigger one than you would expect. So from my perspective, whenever I end up getting out into a project as a product management expert or as a resource, I end up getting this question of, really, how do I get product management or product mindset, and what is it, and how do I get some? This happens a lot in pre-sales and other types of client projects. And the first thing I always like to think about is this concept called the idea maze. And so the idea maze is something that has come out a little while ago, and it's by a concept by Balaji. When it comes to the way he thinks about market research, there's a great paper here, Market Research Wireframing and Design. And this idea maze is really about how do you figure out products, right? So in this case, if you wanted to do something with, say, music or movies on the internet, there's a bunch of different really important decisions that you need to make that will either end you up in a place like YouTube or Netflix or iTunes, but could also end up in places where startups end up going to die, like Napster or Kazaa or something like that. And so, the thing that's most interesting about this maze is it starts to get at how are we starting to figure out what are the things that we actually need to prioritize when it comes to product market fit? Who do we need to be talking to? How do we do customer segmentation? What types of features, or even better yet, what types of problems are we trying to solve for people when it comes to any one of these things? The part that I've always found really interesting about this particular discussion, especially around the idea maze, is it feels like it's missing something. And what is really missing here is that when you first get started, the bottom left-hand side is all that you see. Everything else is completely obscured. You don't know the decision points at that moment. You don't know where you're going to end up because you're not a fortune teller. And you need to go out and essentially find this out, not only by talking to people, but by building in the first place. And so, maybe this gets back to a story that really, I think, stuck with me. So I was interviewing for a head of product position at a pretty small startup. It was, about a 7 or 8 person team, and I was interviewing directly with the CEO. And this is one of those classic kind of product taste or product sense interviews. And what I found over time around this is that it's hard for product managers that are not really well-versed in this interviewing style to go after them. And the reason why is that you're trying to essentially guess what does the other person think is good taste or what is good product sense. So there's a lot of bias and beliefs from the standpoint of the interviewee trying to understand the interviewer. And I think there's always a certain point in everybody's kind of interviewing career or progress that they end up basically asking a lot of questions, being fairly open to the information that they need to have if they were actually working in a product team. And that would mean that they would have to listen to people a lot more. They would have to be asking a lot of questions. They'd want to go out and do research. And they'd want to actually talk to subject matter experts that really understand the problem at a very deep level. Now, the issue with this when you're interviewing is that it comes off that you don't really care that much about anything and that you just want to learn what you should do. And so, after talking to the CEO a couple different times, a couple of the team members, overall, everybody liked working with me. But what it came down to was really 2 things. I think one, I was probably too senior for the role, not to toot my own horn. But secondarily, I think it sounded like I didn't really have much of an opinion about the way that product works in some way. And so I was able to get some time with the CEO afterwards to ask for feedback, because that is definitely always a gift. It's always something that I really prioritize highly. And what I was told by the CEO is that it just didn't seem like I had come off of really having an opinion about the way products should work, and the way that I would actually do something based on my current understanding of the world. And so after this, I started to use a slightly different format for interviewing, but it ended up being one that is much more of false, kind of false understanding of the thing, because I'm not the subject matter expert. I'm not the person that's working in this industry necessarily. And so really going in there and just locking in on making a bunch of assumptions about the way things would work and just moving forward from there. And so this has worked out fairly well for me as far as an interviewing strategy. But I think it gets at the fact that most product managers should actually be very low opinionated about a lot of things until they learn about them. And so, this gets to us to a classic trope within product management, is that really, literally, whenever anybody asks you a question, it starts with "it depends" and then goes from there. And when you're talking between product managers, it usually goes unsaid. But and I also hear that John Cutler is writing a really amazing book about this particular topic around "it depends." But this is the reason why product people have such a hard time explaining what they do or how they think, is because of this fact that they don't know the future, right? Like that when we start to think about how we would approach a problem, it ends up coming from the point of curiosity and trying to understand where we could go with this. And so, I think this is true if you look at things like the first 90-day plans. I just started here at Cognizant back in March. And so, my first kind of 90-day plan as head of product operations was really to talk to every product manager as much as I could. And so going out and understanding, or going to where the work is, and just really deeply diving into that is essential to the way product management works. And the reason why is because then we start to create this nuanced knowledge that when asked a very direct question, the right answer is always "it depends." And so, I think what I've started to do over the last couple months internally to Cognizant Softvision and Cognizant as a whole is really start to get at this idea of how do we train other groups with the product mindset. And so the reason why this is really important is because being better at actually doing things like pre-solutioning, talking to clients, responding to RFPs, and doing even discovery work or just better engineering work really gets down to the fact is, how do we get everybody to think a little bit more like a product manager might with the product mindset? And so we've done this for groups like sales, groups like engineering management, and we're continuing to roll this out to more and more communities. And we talk to them about what the product mindset actually is. And so the way we usually start this presentation is we'll really focus in, and this is a screenshot from a presentation I gave a little while ago, is essentially asking people to ask why more. And this is because we end up having a lot of people that have seen lots of different ways to execute on a particular project. Cognizant is known for its execution. Cognizant Softvision, from the standpoint of how do we build things, we've done an awful lot. And so that execution side, that ability to really get something done is part of our expertise and part of what we're known for in the industry. But what that doesn't mean is that we actually don't ask why enough when we're starting a project, when we're starting to understand a project. And so just getting people to ask a few more why questions tends to really be the core aspect that we need to train other groups besides product management in. And the way that we end up doing this is we'll go into case studies and we'll start to kind of play or role play around, if we have this particular type of case, what would we do? And at first, a lot of the people will focus in on, well, I would just start doing this, or I would start doing this, I would start building this, I would start architecting this. When the best way to go about this, the way that we actually start to build the right product rather than build the product right, is we start to understand the deeper reasons for doing something. And that could be something as simple as, what is the customer outcome we're doing, which I think is like not just necessarily simple, but the most important thing. But also going after factors of like, what is the environment like, or the ecosystem like within the organization that we're trying to do this work? Because I would argue that almost any work that we end up doing, getting meta enough, is really about organizational change, right? There's a reason why you hire companies like Cognizant Softvision, and it's usually to be able to help make change in a way that you couldn't make previously. And so once we get past the initial kind of why questions, we start to dive into all the different types of why questions that could be there. And this example is just around a mobile banking app. There's a lot of assumptions that are tied up inside of these statements around what we're being asked to do in this hypothetical example. And so, if we can really get more people asking these types of questions, the better answers we'll get when we move forward. And so this is really just the premise, is that people do not ask enough questions when first entering into some type of discussion. But why does this matter, right? Like, what are we really trying to get at when it comes to all these things? First, let's stop in at a really quick concept around this idea of PM skills versus product mindset. And so this is something I've seen repeated over and over again whenever I'm actually talking with product people or listening to people talk about what the product mindset is, right? So one of the things that you'll see, and this is an example of a couple different kind of skill assessment competency frameworks that are out there around what makes like maybe a good PM or a great PM or even a unicorn PM, if you want to use that type of terminology. And there's lots of things, right? There's not only strategic thinking and communication, this idea of how are we building alignment, strategy, personas, like all of these different things that are actually skills that we need to pick up to be really good at product management are really things that we need to think about and focus on, but are maybe they're not really just the product mindset. And so I've even built this framework internally about different types of hard to soft skills to intangible skills, this idea of baseline to procedural to delivery to even advanced and specialist skills. There's a wide gamut of things that product managers are actually asked to learn to do and be good at as part of their practice. But I would argue that most of these things don't have a lot to do with the shift in mindset that we're talking about in product management. And maybe a case in point around this is there's a recent Reddit post about the 9 lessons that someone learned from 10 years of working in product. And I saw this posted in a couple different product management Slacks. I read through it in real depth, and I think there's a lot of really great things here, right? The lessons themselves, though, and here, I'll give you a clearer look at what some of these are. The problem I really see with most of these lessons is that they don't really have anything to do with being just a product manager. You could argue that being a great engineering manager or architect or executive or customer support or success person, you could benefit by having any of these different lessons really apply to your life. And so, this has started to make me try to break apart what are the skills that product managers need to know versus what is this product mindset in the way that we see it executed and the way we see it really being helpful to people. And so what I would argue, right, and maybe one of the hypotheses here is that really good PMs, they could have the product mindset, but there are plenty of people that I've worked with that, may ensure some success as a product manager in a large organization, like the ability to have good communication, to be able to manage up, to be able to do any of these different things, but they don't necessarily embody the product mindset, which I think really gets at how is it that product managers really build differential things in the world? And then I would argue that, yeah, that's true that bad people that are considered to be not great at product management probably don't have the product mindset. But I've seen plenty of people that maybe are not able to execute the core skills around product management, but in some way are actually embodying the product mindset itself. And so, I think the product mindset to me is really about a belief about the world. And the belief of that world is something I want to go into in just a second. So let's take this idea maze and let's compare it against another concept that's referred to as the deception. And the deception is something that really comes from this book by Kenneth Stanley and Joel Lehman around called Why Greatness Cannot Be Planned. And while this book, I don't think has gotten wide distribution when it comes to being a product management book, I would say it's one of my top 10 favorite books in general. Because of the mindsets that it talks about. But the reason why it's so interesting is that it's mostly a machine learning and AI book, mostly about this idea of open-ended evolution or novelty-based search. But I think it really gets at a lot of lessons that product managers can learn that would be really helpful. And in particular, it's about this thing called Pick Breeder. And so Pick Breeder, you can see here, is a bunch of images that were actually generated by a machine learning algorithm. And when I say they were generated, they're actually, I believe, a fairly complicated, but not complex kind of set of rules that will then generate these different pictures. Now, what's interesting about this is that it used something called genetic algorithms to be able to take kind of a genetic strain for each one of these different images. And then it used a fitness calculation, which is essentially the ability for which one is better in some realm. And in our case, what ended up happening for the pick breeder was that people on the internet would go and look at these pictures and they'd say, of these set of pictures, and sometimes it would be a couple, sometimes it would be two, you'd be able to choose which one you thought was best. And then what it would do is it would take that picture and then breed it a bit more and then give you another set of pictures. And so there's this kind of like walk through an evolutionary space that would get you to some like really interesting pictures. At first, when you look at them, they're not really colorized. They tend to be black and white. They're like kind of ovals or shades, and they don't really look like much. But the part that's most interesting about this is that the evolutionary part of this is actually just human beings going and saying what was more kind of aesthetically appealing, which is a very hard thing to quantify. And so why I found this so interesting is that we started it somewhere that was super, super basic as far as the ability to draw something, and then evolved into things that actually look like real images, like skulls or cars or butterflies. And the butterfly on the cover of the book is actually one of those generated images. And so this is amazing results, and really ends up talking through the rest of the book about this idea of how novelty-based search can get you in a lot of places, which is going after things in places that you haven't been before, rather than this idea of very directed things. And that's because of something that is referred to as the deception around an objective. And so one of the arguments that are made in this book is this idea of vacuum tubes. And so when vacuum tubes were first created, they were used for like various types of modulation, things like that, but they weren't really used for the eventual use of computation, which then eventually turned into the model around transistors, that then turned into more complicated computers, that then got us to mobile phones and got us to all of these crazy things that we have today in comparison to a couple hundred years ago. And so at no point during the time that people that actually were creating vacuum tubes, there was no way for them to know that they would have ended up with a computer eventually. And that's amazing to think about. They were going after certain objectives that made sense to them at the time, but were not actually to the point where we are today. And honestly, they're not at the point where they will be in, say, 100 years from now. And I think when we talk about the evolutionary principles that are at play here, it's like the idea of trying to evolve a human being from like a piece of bacteria, and choosing what are the different types of constraints and evolutionary pressures that you're going to put on it to try to get a human. And evolution, frankly, doesn't care, right? Like evolution is more about the idea of survival of a particular line of genetics, for example. And so there's no way that you could have told that way back then a bacteria would have turned into a human, or even been able to set up the right types of objectives and constraints to be able to do that. Now, the reason why this is so interesting is not just the fact that that happens, right? But it's also the fact that when that person was creating the vacuum tube, there was no way for them to know that there was going to be this eventual computer. And the analogy that Stanley and Lehman end up using in their book is really this idea of trying to walk across a lake using a set of stones. And so in this case, there's a fairly straightforward path, but let's imagine that there's even more stones that are everywhere in this entire lake, right? And the added problem of this is that while we may have an objective to get to the other side of the lake, that objective is actually very hard for us to, in some way, go towards, because we don't know the direction that the stones are actually taking us. And then we add on top of this idea that there's some type of fog that is obscuring the ability for us to actually see the rest of the lake. So I think the part that I'd like to just argue here is that we don't know what's ahead of us. We don't know what we need to do to get to the next place. And so in some way, that objective is really the problem. And so, and great quote that I like to use from here is really this situation, when the objective function when the objective function is a false compass, is called deception, which is a fundamental problem in search. And so if we think about everything that we do while we're building something, and I would say that when we build things that we build over and over again, that's very different. That's very much like a manufacturing process where you spend very little time on design, and then you just spend lots and lots of time stamping out the same thing over and over again and maybe optimizing. But most of what we do when it comes to creating software projects, creating really fundamental change for our clients, right? We actually don't know what the compass is a lot of the time. We may know what types of business impacts we want to make change for, but this idea of an end objective until we've gone through the process of not only building things, but also testing with people, we actually don't know what that end goal is. And so that idea maze, again, while a very interesting concept, doesn't actually help us, right? It doesn't help us actually get to the other side of the lake. It doesn't help us get from some type of vacuum tube to a computer. And so what I would argue is that the fundamental and foundational problem that the product mindset is trying to address is this uncertainty of the world. And I would argue that this uncertainty is something that will always exist. And the reason why is that and this gets back to fundamental things around the way that, say, biology works, which goes into the idea of like explore versus exploit, the idea of not being able to have truly deterministic systems that we can understand, right? Things may be causative, but the issue is that we don't see all of the different causes that led up to today's point, and there's no way that we can ever compute everything that will be a cause for some type of future point. We can make predictions, we can make bets, but there's no way that we will know for sure. So I would argue that uncertainty is really everything that the product mindset is trying to understand and wrangle and embrace in some way. And this type of uncertainty comes up in all types of things that we do, right? Objectives, goals, those are definitely things that are more like a compass, but is that compass really a GPS? Is it really telling us where we are? Is it really telling us where we need to go? The idea of vision and strategy as things that are helping us make better decisions, or help market to people, or help recruit people to our purposes. It is not a sure thing, right? Even the customers that we decide to work for or solve problems for, the features or epics that we end up building, right? The things we put in our backlogs, like user stories, all of those things are incredibly uncertain. And usually they are just drafts, they're bets, they're things that we think will work, but may not. And then I would argue, one of my biggest trigger moments is really talking about storytelling. And so I would argue that there is so much uncertainty, not only in per person, per team, per organization, but I would argue that story points are one of those things where we have to realize that there's the most uncertainty around. And then I'd say that there's more kind of like less tactical or less things that are tacit and more things that are more like intangible, I guess. Things that are softer that also include a lot of uncertainty, but we don't always either think about it that way or realize it. Definitely opinions do, right? Getting back to that product taste or sense, there's a lot of uncertainty about what is good product taste or sense. Without the context of a user, without the context of a person, without the context of trying something out, these are all just guesses again, they're bets. Same thing with the idea of like judgment, feedback, or evaluation over someone else, the way that they do their work, the work that they actually end up doing. There's a lot of uncertainty, not only about the way your opinion is about that work, but about the context of that work and how it works in the end. And then I think that this idea of 2 cents, and I think Derek Silver's wrote a really great post about this around kind of, especially for people that are in positions of power around how 2 cents work. You end up skewing things that may not be helpful in the end, right? So I think there's a lot of things that we should just allow for more uncertainty, and we should think about that are actually more uncertainty than they actually are. So the product mindset is about embracing the uncertainty of the world. It's about figuring out a way for us to dance with it, so that our teams can still be successful, can be resilient, so that they can be robust, and so that they can actually learn and move forward to the future and survive. And so that uncertainty is something that I'm constantly thinking about, and constantly thinking about how do we, one, make an argument for better understanding of uncertainty, but also how do you now actually, say, reduce some of the uncertainty, but also allow for it when it comes to mindsets and processes. And so a short list that I'll make here are really around, like, if we want to embrace uncertainty, right, we should do more user research. We should ask more questions of our customers. We should be going and seeing what it's like for them on the ground, things like contextual inquiry, things like Sales Safari. Those are all things that embrace the uncertainty that my concept or my opinion about something is actually not the only one. And it's not my customers, right? Like the phrase, "you are not your user," is 100% true. The moment that you start building something, even if you are actually a user of that, you will not be the user anymore because of the models that you start to build in your head. Hypothesis driven work, in general gets at this idea that we also need to go out and find out more. We don't know for sure what is going to happen. When it comes to experimentation, the reason why we make things like experimentation so small, or experiments so small and nimble, and trying to be as fast and as many as possible, is because we assume that even when we put together an experiment, it could possibly be the wrong one. We also need to trust people on our teams more, right? I make a point in all of the different team discussions that we have that there are different circles of expertise and decision-making authority. And that could mean in a council meeting where there's senior PMs meeting with PMs that are on projects, trusting their interpretation of the events or the recounting of those events. I trust them when it comes to that type of thing. And the same thing goes cross-discipline. We should always be trying to embrace the fact that other disciplines have more of a stake in things that are more technical, more usability, design-oriented, more branding-oriented, more executive understanding-oriented. That's why we're in a team. We should trust more of our teams more. We should then also push decisions down to the people that are actually closest to the information. And this is like a very important thing that in a lot of the leadership coaching and training that I end up doing for some of our clients, it ends up being that once you let go of some of these things, you need to give power back to people that are actually making decisions. If you continue to hold on to that power and you stifle that idea of power redistribution, you're not going to be actually doing things that are agile. And then you're also not going to be allowing for people to embrace the product mindset in the understanding of uncertainty. And then I would say, finally, you're not embracing the product mindset and really embracing that uncertainty that's there. The part that I think is interesting is that even though you are trying to redistribute power to the rest of your team when you talk about embracing the product mindset and say agility in general, but this idea of now making hard decisions becomes even more important for leaders. They need to be there to do that. If they're not there making hard decisions, the question is that they're not there just trying to enforce power anymore. And then the second thing is that if they're not making hard decisions, what are they actually doing? They may provide additional context, which I think is another very, very important thing for people that are in leadership positions, stakeholders, etc. But at that point, you just become a subject matter expert. So the whole point of these things when we talk about embracing the product mindset is how do you get really good at making these hard decisions? And then when we talk about different types of evaluation methodologies, right? I'd say that there's three that I've come across in the majority of teams, and the first one is really around impact, right? Were you able to change this number? That works when you're talking about very short-term thinking things where you know the map, where you know what you can do with regards to levers to be able to make change. The next step when it comes to cohesion, to the idea of evaluation processes, is that you go after competency-based evaluation. And that means that you're looking at, is this person exemplifying or embodying really what we think of as like really, really important when it comes to doing their job. And then I'd say that the last step actually is really to get this point of cohesion, which is, are you a good teammate? And the reason why I think that's so interesting in the product mindset and uncertainty world is that for team cohesion to be good, that means you need to make less assumptions and make less certainty about the people you're working with. You need to approach them with the same curiosity that you do with user research and other people that you're building for as far as your customers. So I think these are like really, really important ways for us to embrace uncertainty as things go forward. And so, I think the argument that I would make now is that there are a lot of really, really big companies that invest in the face of humongous uncertainty. And this is what really great leaders do in general. And so, I think we have a lot of our clients that tend to not be digital first, that were, founded during times when there was not such a kind of in-depth belief that digital worlds were really meaningful in some way. And they're constantly looking at the FANG companies to basically ask, what is it that they could do to be more like them? Because being like them means that they are going to be, in some way, one, more successful, but also these companies tend to embrace the product mindset more in the way that leaders end up making those big bets. So I'd like to just have a little, maybe not really a quiz, but I would love to see if people can pick up what the quotes are about in these next couple slides. And so first, let's look at this quote. $500, I said that is the most expensive phone in the world. So if people were able to tell who this was and what they're talking about, I'd love to kind of counterbalance that with another leader's kind of note about the way that things work inside of the organization. And sometimes when you innovate, you make mistakes. And so on the left-hand side, we have Steve Ballmer talking about the iPhone back when it first came out. And on the right, we have Steve Jobs talking about the idea of innovation, right? And I think this is really important. The difference between these two different mentalities, I think, is fairly stark. And so let's do another one. So on the left-hand side, we have, I don't really worry so much about blank, and I'll tell you what that is in a second. To be very blunt with you, we need to worry about ourselves. We're in a great position. And then I want to counterbalance that with the other leader this person was just talking about. It's incredibly hard to get people to take bold bets. And if you push people to take bold bets, there will be experiments that don't work. And so the two people here, on the left-hand side, it's someone from Oracle talking about AWS. And on the right-hand side, it's Jeff Bezos talking about the way that they did experimentation and thinking about the idea of really big bets. And so the difference between these two different things, and really the core difference between the left person and the right person, right, is not only the fact that we're usually talking about businesses that were established or, fairly well placed within their industries and customer segments when those quotes were made, against someone else that really believed something more foundationally different than the way that they did about the world. And so I would argue that this is really this idea that people that are very successful tend to also focus on these uncertainties. And so Jeff Bezos, there's a great story that I had heard from my friend Cedric, who really focuses on this idea of like adaptation of expertise, where Jeff Bezos looking at something like, how do we get Alexa really good at hearing people inside of rooms? He wanted to get a plan about like, what was the total amount of money, like, how do we really get good at this? And the people that were putting together the plan were really worried about providing some type of small, something that was too big of a budget to be able to do this. And basically, when given this budget that was fairly small on a 6-pager, as Amazon people usually do, he was like, this isn't bold enough. This isn't like the right bet. I want you to come back and just tell me, like, what is the right thing for us to do here? And they went in and they said, okay, well, if we really want to do this right, we would go and get a bunch of apartments across the world. We would set up fake apartment areas. We would then listen. We'd have tons of people going through there just like saying different things from different places. And this is probably going to cost us like $10 million. And Jeff then looked at that proposal and said, yes, this is the right type of bet, right? Like it's a huge amount of money for an unknown amount of benefit. Like we think it will be beneficial in some way. But there's no other thing that we could do right now other than embrace this uncertainty and move forward with this. And so I think this is something that we should all be considering, is how do we not only embrace uncertainty, but really focus on those big bets. And so uncertainty feels uncomfortable, right? This is something that is super hard for us to get really good at. And when I was first starting out of school as a program manager at Microsoft, we would joke sometimes that program or product managers were not really worth anything for the first 2 years of their lives. And the reason why was because they had to pick up, all of these different kind of experiential things that gave them tacit knowledge about how to do the job. But I would argue it's also because they had to burn off all of these certainties that were built up in school over time. And so, one of the key things, right, is really around this concept of the growth mindset. And so you will never feel completely great about the uncomfortableness or the uncertainty that you end up having in this world. But as Abby mentioned earlier today with his talk about product mindset and reducing risk, really this growth mindset is the beginning point of this, right? We are not fixed. We are able to continue to change ourselves and the world around us. And if we weren't, then that idea maze that we have would not be cloudy. It would be something that would be very apparent to us. And the end point is really to get better at how do we just harness uncertainty and burn away most of our certainty about the work that we end up doing. And so, I think I've tried to really embody and focus on this through not only talking to enough people, like learning about other people's problems, I think ends up, building one type of certainty, which is like understanding breadth of problems, but then also always understanding and burning away the certainty that I will know that there is every problem that I know today, because there's always new ones. There's always nuance that I end up learning from. This is why things like wargaming and other types of like really interesting techniques around case studies and decision forcing cases end up being really helpful in some ways, that they help introduce experiential effects that you would only usually get through ride-alongs or doing the job yourself. But at that point, are you acting with a state of certainty that is actually negatively impacting your ability to do the job? And so finally, I think, why do product orgs generally have a hard time embracing this product mindset? And I think there's a couple things that really go into this. So the first thing is that, of course, certainty, right? We end up being very certain about functions, features, ideas, solutions. Those are all things that we end up being incredibly certain about. And the reality is we should be probably more certain about the principles or purpose or vision that we have. But even then, we need to be less certain about it than we are today. The second thing is that there's lots of biases that we end up taking on. Dominant logic is the discussion of how do we focus on things that made us successful in the past and apply it to the future. But those biases, right, they are helpful for us to make snap decisions, but they're not the right types of biases for us to always be embracing. We need to be constantly thinking about that. The next thing is these idea of assumptions, right? Getting back to dominant logic, there's a set of assumptions that you're working with that have worked for you previously, but may not work in the future and may actually be harmful to you in the future. So how do we, these assumptions end up being kind of hesitant embracing the product mindset from that perspective. And then finally, this idea of power within organizations that perpetuates the power itself ends up fighting against a lot of this questioning of certainty, right? If we can question certainty, what else can we question? And so now, what I would argue that we should all be doing about this is, one, whenever we're talking about a project, before we started it, before we finished it, we should be rejecting as much certainty as possible. We should be embracing as much uncertainty as possible. And we should do that by way of, asking people that are our customers. We should be talking to them, observing them. We should be thinking about how we help all of the people on our team understand that uncertainty. And we should be really focusing on wrangling in a way that is helpful, rather than a way that is overly fixating us on a particular outcome. We need to test our biases. And there's a lot of interesting ways to do this. I would say that one that I've found to be very helpful is to randomly assault the biases that we have today. I think if we do not do this, we will constantly be falling back into the traps of bias. And Jeremy Horn talked about this earlier, but this idea of diversity of people and thought within our organizations ends up helping us test these biases. We should be challenging the assumptions that we have about everything. Dominant logic provides one way for us to think about, if we were to take this assumption and flip it, is it the same world? Is it a different world? But I think we need to constantly be thinking of ways that we are not only documenting and discussing, but challenging our assumptions. And then we need to be giving power back to the teams, right? For us to really embrace the product mindset, and for everybody to embrace the product mindset, we need to be able to understand the right level of uncertainty for us and for our teams. And that ends up being for us and for the teams to decide. So in closing, I really want to give you 3 things to do from here. So the first thing is I want you to reject certainty and the belief that we can somehow predict how software development will work. There are ways that we can de-risk it. There are ways we can reduce that uncertainty. But anything more than that is a deception, as Stanley would call it. Embrace the uncertainty of the work we do and take advantage of it. The reason why uncertainty is interesting, right? If you've ever read the book, How to Measure Anything, it talks about this idea of diminishing returns for purchasing of information. And so the good thing is that everybody is uncertain as well. And so if we can in some way build organizations that are more resilient and harness that uncertainty, we are way more likely to be able to build teams that are not only resilient in the face of humongous change, which we see today in today's world, but also from a competitive standpoint. And then I think we get back to the core message that I give a lot of people in my product mindset training, but asking why more often is really, really helpful. And asking why, not only down at the level of why is this requirement here? Why is this process here? Why are we doing this? But also just asking why at exec and leadership levels ends up getting us closer to the point that we're no longer just taking bias and assumption out of face value and certainty. And so thank you so much, everybody, for the time today. This is my email address if you ever want to reach out to me. And then also that's my Twitter handle. I'd love to hear your thoughts. And we have some time now for questions. So thank you so much again for everybody's time.
Thank you, Chris. We do have a few questions that came in from the chat.
Great.
The first one, how do you convince stakeholders who are fixated on their ideas to embrace uncertainty?
Yeah, I think there's a two-pronged approach to this, right? This is a question I get from a lot of PMs, especially junior PMs, that will say something along the lines of like, I have this great idea and how do I convince my manager to do this, right? Or I've heard it plenty of times as like stakeholders or clients or something like that. And the first thing you need to do is understand their context more, right? You need to be more curious and embrace that product mindset of uncertainty around that you do not actually know why they're thinking what they're thinking. And so going and discovering why they think that way, and sometimes it could be because they have more understanding or scope of the world in some way, like they get access to more information than you, more broad information, maybe not as much depth information, but they may have some context that could help you in some way. And then the second thing is that by understanding that context, you can actually then start to look at where is there false certainty, and again, maybe not saying that to them directly, but starting to go after like, why is this assumption here, right? And that assumption could also be things that are not only like from the standpoint of an organizational one or a customer one, but from a personal one, right? We are all people existing within organizations that are trying to get something done, not only for our orgs, but also for us as individuals. Like, what are our goals and fears when it comes to doing stakeholder understanding is, I think, really, really important. So I think that's the thing, is that by understanding people better, right, you can actually do way more to get at the assumptions they're going at. And there are interesting techniques like the CFAR, which is like the Center for Rational Thought. I forget the full acronym name. They have something called double crux, where trying to understand like, what is the one thing that if we both changed, we would be in agreement? I think is like a really interesting approach. What is that one thing that we're really disagreeing about right now, not the surface level things? And I love to quote, Ender from Ender's Game, and I've used this in like a competitive analysis article as well, but like, once I really know my enemy, right, and I know how to defeat them, I really love them, right? And I'm definitely paraphrasing here, but I think it's a really interesting quote because, for you to understand a competitive landscape, it's not about how do you stack up as far as features, like the checklist of features you're going to go and do, but it's how do you understand really their decision-making process, right? How do you get inside, in the Boydian, John Boydian sense of like the OODA loop for them, their decision-making process. So I think that's really valuable. So yeah. Be more curious about why your managers or clients or stakeholders have that opinion about something. And then two, use that to help leverage and understand what are really the cruxes of the difference of opinion. And that's what I would say.
Thank you. Another one that came through. Can you expand a little bit more on the hypothesis-driven work? How would that look, for example, within an engineering team owning some part of an app? How often would you form the hypothesis and how do you check it?
Well, here's the thing is that I think once you start doing something like hypothesis-driven work, you always have a hypothesis. It's just that, and you may actually have multiple hypotheses, some of which have more evidence for them being true than others, right? And I would add, like, there's also this murky issue that once you prove a hypothesis, the local Maxima Hill could move out from underneath you because the fact that, the world just keeps evolving and changing. And so once you have this idea of a hypothesis, and the hypothesis is usually, we believe that if we make some change in the world, that we make some change, and that's usually like shipping software in our case, or shipping a prototype or something like that, right? We'll see this change in the wider part of the world, and it could be increasing, business impacts like increasing revenue, reducing costs. It could be very specific ones like getting better click-through rate, which is incredibly tactical, or it could be something, the sweet spot for these types of hypotheses tend to be around outcomes for a person somewhere in the world, right? So for a customer, for a partner, for another employee. And so once you have that, I think the biggest thing that, mistake that people make when they start to approach hypothesis-driven work is they actually will be asked, usually by a powerful stakeholder, to go off and either prove or disprove one particular solution. And so what that ends up doing is it actually ends up really limiting what you have available to you from the standpoint of the experiment you're going to run, right? And I kind of like rule of hand, right? I think it was Spotify that came out with this report about like of all the different experiments they run on their platform, 1/3 of them are actually end up succeeding in the way that they hope they would. 1/3 have no effect whatsoever, and 1/3 actually do the opposite of what they had hoped for. And so if we're using those as the rule of hand, if you give me one experiment to run, only 1/3 I have like a 1 in 3 chance of that actually being good and working. With hypothesis-driven approaches, you're actually looking at the hypothesis as not being an end solution, but more about like a set of things that you believe about the world that you want to go out and test, and you will do that through experimentation of solutions. And again, I think I like to pull in basically Beck's 3X model on this. So it's looking at something like the S curve and seeing explore, expand, and exploit as the 3 different parts of the S curve. And then the explore part, really for there's not a lot of metrics you can look at because you have no idea what you're doing and you don't know what really is going to be valuable at that point. And so when you're optimizing for that stage of like the 3X, you're actually trying to do as many experiments, cheap, small experiments as you can. So I'd argue the other thing is that that people end up mistaking in this hypothesis-driven approach is that you end up creating like hypotheses that require an experiment that is really large, rather than a lot of small ones that interconnect in some way to build an understanding of the world. And so I'd say like, maybe the summary of the advice I would give is that one, you should think about it from the standpoint of like, what is the problem you're solving, the outcome you're trying to get. You should think about it as how do you build as many small, cheap, fast experiments as you can. And that sometimes doesn't mean shipping code to the end customer. Sometimes it means a prototype of some type. And really going after it from that standpoint. Once you can do that, the engineering team, I think like the people that end up helping with this stuff tend to be people like user researchers, product managers, designers are all really helpful in this stuff. And that's why I tend to advocate for cross-discipline pods when it comes to how we actually do great work here at Cognizant Softvision. But if an engineering team, you can just take it upon yourself. There are going to be people that are more likely to embrace this uncertainty mindset than others. So I think that's like a very valuable way to get started. It's very small and cheap, fast as you can. But also, maybe this gets to the broader thing, which is that when we talk about things like strategy, right? Strategy is a mental model for how we make hard decisions. We end up seeing strategy on a kind of on a curve, like if we look at the normal distribution, as being kind of like in the middle. It's like 3 to 6 months out is kind of what we're constantly trying to use our strategy to figure out what to do. And that's why roadmaps end up being that distance, things like that. But the reality is what we want this like nothing in the 3 to 6 month range. What we want a strategy that you apply right now in this moment towards this decision that is in some way timeless. And so the more that you can push these things to the barbell ends of like of being able to really focus in on a strategy that is appropriate now, I think you become much more effective at those things. And that's why like getting in an outcome you can try to do for a customer, I think helps you get there. And I think that's why we focus on problems, we focus on outcomes, rather than the idea of like we ship this feature or we actually built this solution in some way. That's very like output type of thinking that I think gets you back into that mode of kind of 3 to 6 months out. There's always going to be a perfect solution. When the reality is there's not. There never will be. Good question.
Thank you. Well, those are all the questions that we have in the chat so far.
Cool.
Any other final nuggets of wisdom?
Yeah, I mean, this is a really tough thing to embrace, right? And I think a lot of organizations struggle with this. And that's why they end up hiring Cognizant Softvision, because they do struggle with this. But I think using some of the philosophical and kind of principled things that I talked about today, this takes a mindset shift for a lot of people that are higher up in the organization as well. But I think once you do, this is where you start to build defensible, differentiated cultures inside of organizations. Right? A great example of kind of cultural expertise is from the Toyota production system, right? So there are plenty of people, like if you look at the Toyota production system, there's a whole bunch of things that actually underlie and end up being foundational for the way the Toyota production system works, which was really a way to do kind of like lean manufacturing. It was wildly successful from the 50s, 60s, 70s, right? When people try to just take that framework of Toyota production system and drop it down to somewhere else, they don't have all of the structure and foundation that TPS had for it. And so what that means is that the cultural system, one tries to reject it, which is why I would argue that starting small with cultural transformation tends to work better. So like in one team, and then allowing that to spread over time as you see success. But it's also the fact that if the people that are in power that are actually able to make philosophical change within the organization are not willing to make that change, they're pretty much the reason why these organizations will not get better, right? there's a certain level of what people can actually make change in, right? Like maybe as someone that's inside of an engineering team or a pod, I can actually make a change about like work in progress limits. But there's a limitation to what that effect will have if there's significant value and philosophical differences that are in the upper management or kind of vision and strategy areas that are basically overriding those changes I'm trying to make. So I would just say that this is something that every leader that's out there should be asking themselves the question, are they too certain about the people that are on their team? Are they too certain about the future? And how could they be more uncertain? How could they actually embrace uncertainty in a way that would get their teams to be building more interesting and more differentiated product offerings? So yeah, I think that's all I'd say.
All right, thank you, Chris. One last question just came in.
Right.
Any indications that a PM is taking things too ambiguous versus embracing uncertainty?
Yeah, it's interesting. I mean, I think like the part that I've found to be more helpful, right? So like, I don't think that hypotheticals help as much in the product world. So the idea of like, what would you do with this limited amount of information? I think it you end up asking too many questions. Like I've been starting to experiment with something called decision forcing cases, where it's essentially a case study that's interactive with people. And the first thing that product managers do, which I think is great, is they ask a lot of questions about like more background. And the thing that's interesting about this decision forcing case is it actually forces them down a path that it doesn't matter what all the things they would do, like this is what happened and here's how you have to contend with it. I think that the problem with these types of more generic case studies, like here's like a single paragraph about the situation, tell me what to do, it doesn't really help. And so I would say that adding more nuance to things and adding more detail actually is a better way to talk about stuff, like what is the actual circumstance. And so the way we end up actually creating our product council meetings, where it's for a product person that's on a particular meeting, a particular engagement, we have a meeting with a bunch of different PMs, usually more senior ones in the organization, to not only kind of pose what is the challenge they have and what they've tried and what they're willing to try, but then part of that meeting is actually just to ask questions by the other people in the meeting, because there's no way that we will have the full context, right? But by asking these questions, it not only helps that product person start to hone in on what questions they should be asking themselves or their stakeholders, or their clients, but then also starts to look into, did they already try something? And so is that question still helpful in some way? And so you start to build this knowledge about what are the actual, like, what are the ways that we move forward from today's world, rather than just taking more generic hypothetical examples. Now, using that idea of pushing strategy to either the immediate now or the infinite future, you start to consider, what are the assumptions we're making about this world that we're making decisions on? What are the principles we're using? What is the decision-making model that we're using? And so it becomes way more important for leaders to not only communicate those things. That could be through memo documents, presentations, discussion, OKRs, things like that. But it could also require for people to ask more questions about those things. So I don't know. I mean, I think if anybody ever just like asks a question and the answer with just, it depends, that's not good enough. That's too ambiguous, right? So the recommendation I'll give to the person who's asking the question is to give a bit more nuance about the situation. And then for the person answering that, I would one, ask more questions. And then two, if you have to make an assumption about the way the way you think it is actually working, then that's also helpful, right? So make an assumption, just state outright, like, okay, well, I assume that this is going on. And this is part of kind of the, do the job you want type of role, that if like a product manager is put on a client project where it's not explicitly a product management role, it's maybe more like a scrum master or project manager role, like I still want them to go after and try to figure out those decision-making models that make them successful as product managers. So in the middle of those meetings where you're doing like a bug triage, being able to say, like, I think this bug is more important than this bug because of this reason, it gives you an opportunity to check your thinking with this stakeholder or client or whatever, where they can say, oh yeah, I agree with that. That's the right type of model for me. Or it could be that they're like, no, I totally disagree, and here's the reason why. Right? So there's a way through this work, as you're doing it, to actually explore and expand more of your understanding of the current situation as well. And that goes both for the question asker and the question answer, right? Because we should not be tearing those two things apart. They're part of the same discussion when we talk about it. So thank you. It's a great question.
All right, thank you, Chris. Those are all the questions that we have today. And we appreciate you taking the time to speak with us. And thank you to all those listening in.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, so please reach out. I would love to connect with all of you. I'd love to hear your reaction to this, whether you think I'm full of BS or not. It's something that I'm very passionate about, as you can probably tell. So I'd love to talk to all of you about